I'm standing in front of the beautiful Mount Rainier in Washington State, and as you can see, there's amazing wildflowers in the foreground. It's peak wildflower season, so there's beautiful blues and purples, and the mountain behind me is just absolutely amazing. There's crazy glaciers on top of it, and this is the perfect time to continue our discussion on composition. Next, we're going to talk about weight and balance, and these are two of the most important parts about composing good images. Every single item in your frame has visual weight attached to it. And that's just how much your viewers will look at one item rather than everything else. So why are visual weight and balance so important in photography? On one hand, take the scene behind me, for example. Obviously, the mountain is the most important part of my photograph. It's my primary subject, and it's what my viewer's eye will gravitate towards first. So why do I need to know this? Well, because I know what the most important part of the photo is, I can frame the image in a way that emphasizes it and guides the viewer's eye along the right path. On the other hand, balance and visual weight are so important to your image because they affect the emotional feel of your photograph. For example, if I have an image that's way too imbalanced to one side or the other, stuff with very high visual weight is placed near the edges, then I'll end up with a very tense photograph that can be difficult to look at. At the same time, if I've got a photograph that's completely balanced, it might be too static and the viewer's eye wouldn't move around the frame very much. So then which elements of a photograph actually have visual weight? Well, think about the items that we look at and are attracted to in the real world. You have objects that are brightly colored, highly saturated, high in contrast, detail, faces, huge items, even items that are unusual or very recognizable. All of these obviously attract much more attention than just a flat gray area of the photograph, which makes it so clear why they add visual weight to your image. When it comes to balance, think of your photographs as a seesaw. Now, if I have a seesaw in the real world and there's someone sitting on one end and no one sitting on the other end, the seesaw will be very imbalanced. The same goes for your photographs. If I have an item that's very high in visual weight on either the left or the right-hand side of the image, obviously the photograph will not be well balanced. So if I only have one item in my image and then the rest of the photograph does not have very high visual weight, placing that item in the very center of the frame creates the most balanced photograph. The same goes if I have two items in the photograph with equal visual weight, placing them the same distance from the center will again lead to a very balanced image. Now, balance works like a seesaw from left to right, not from top to bottom. It doesn't actually matter where in height you place an item with high visual weight. Now, this might sound weird, but it's actually the same that's true in people as well. If you think of a person, we see them as very balanced and symmetrical, but obviously from our head to our toes, we're not all that symmetrical. It's only from left to right that that's true. However, balance isn't always this simplistic. For example, I can have one visually heavy element on one side of the frame, and then several lightweight elements on the other side, and still have a balanced image. At the same time, I could have a very heavy item on one side and then just a single lightweight element that's placed very far to the other side of the photograph and still, again, end up with a balanced photograph. Now, this is similar to when I have a seesaw. I can place the adult near the middle of the seesaw and a child near the end of the seesaw and still have a balanced seesaw. It's also worth mentioning that this is not an exact science. On one hand, you can't necessarily say exactly how much visual weight each element of the photograph has. At the same time, even if you could, balancing them perfectly would be a very subjective task. Ultimately, it's up to what looks good to you as a photographer and how you choose to balance a given frame. So when you're taking photographs, what are you looking for? Do you prefer a sense of balance, imbalance, or somewhere in between? Well, typically, for landscape photography, you will be after a balanced image, and this is because they look stable and completely natural. At the same time, don't discount imbalanced images immediately. Sometimes you might be looking at a photograph and really like it, and then think to yourself, man, this is completely out of balance. Maybe the photographer did that intentionally. Imbalanced images can add a sense of drama and tension to the photograph that wouldn't necessarily be there with a completely balanced photograph. The importance of balance and visual weight cannot be overstated in landscape photography. When I'm out taking pictures and I'm composing my image, they're the first things on my mind, whether I'm looking for a balanced or an imbalanced photograph. I might look at the scene, ask myself how much visual weight each one of the items has, and then compensate my framing accordingly. For example, take a look at the scene behind me. Obviously, there's only one main subject, and that's the mountain. So if I wanted to balance the image, it'd be pretty easy just to put that near the center. But if I had a giant cloud off to one side, I would have to adjust my composition in order to create a more balanced frame. Clearly, balance and visual weight are very important topics in landscape photography. Previously, you might not have considered things like primary subject, secondary subject, and even distracting highlights in the background that all have visual weight. But as you continue taking photographs, your eye for these things will improve and you'll be able to balance your compositions accordingly. As a photographer, you've probably heard of a few different rules for composing your images, and typically these relate back to balance. For example, there's central composition, and that's when you take your main subject, like this mountain behind me, and place it in the center of your photograph. Now, more than you might expect, in landscape photography, central composition can actually create very pleasing images because they'll be much more balanced than the photograph would be if the primary subject were off to the left or right. Without a doubt, central composition can be very effective. If I have a tree, for example, and it's my only subject, I'm very likely to compose it in the center of the frame to emphasize the symmetry and the beauty of it. At the same time, if I've got a rainbow going across my landscape, chances are good that I'll compose it near the center so that the photograph is balanced rather than off to the left or the right-hand side. At the same time, central composition is not the only way to take good landscape photographs. For example, you've probably heard of the rule of thirds, which suggests that you should imagine a grid over your photograph that divides it into 9 equal parts, and then place your main subject or your horizon along one of the lines or intersection points. Now, obviously, the rule of thirds suggests that you should off-center your subject, which means that the image wouldn't be as balanced as a central composition in most cases. So why do people use it? The main idea is to off-center your main subject so that it adds interest to your frame. Now, this might seem a little bit counterintuitive because our eyes immediately gravitate towards the center of a photograph before the edges. But if you only have one main subject and you place it off-center, then your viewer will look at the center of the frame and then their eye will move over to the actual subject. That creates movement, which adds interest to the photograph. Because of this, off-center compositions can be very powerful. However, there are a couple issues with the rule of thirds specifically that are important to talk about. On one hand, because the rule of thirds is so strict about each one of the third lines, it's typically not going to be exactly perfect for a given photo. For example, if I want to off-center my main subject, I might think that 1/4 of the way or 2/5 of the way off-center actually looks better than just the plain 1/3 line. At the same time, some people get so caught up in using the rule of thirds that they ignore other possible compositions. Some people even change their viewfinder in the camera to only show the rule of thirds, and then they compose every single photograph exactly that way. The rule of thirds works well as a reminder to beginners that off-central composition can make a photograph look very good, but at the same time, it's not an exact end-all be-all for the specific spot that you should put an off-central subject. Another rule of composition that you might have heard of is called the golden ratio. And although we do see the golden ratio some places in nature, not that many photographers actually use it to compose their images. Instead, people will look at their favorite photos or other works of art that they really like, and later on superimpose the golden ratio on that image to justify why they like it so much. Now, personally, I never really use the golden ratio. I typically compose a photograph so that it's well balanced or intentionally off-center, just depending upon the scene. So when you hear about things like the rule of thirds, the golden ratio, or other rules of composition that tell you to place your subject exactly along one part of the photograph, realize that rules are not what make great photos. Instead, the right subject, good lighting, good color, and things like balance are what matter. I'm not going to tell you not to use the rule of thirds if you find it useful, but I strongly recommend composing every image for its own merits. Positive and negative space are two other elements that have a significant effect on the feel of an image. So what are positive and negative space? Let's take the most basic of examples, the words on a page of paper. Now, when you're reading through a page of paper, obviously it's the letters that stand out and the page that fades into the background. And that's because the page is negative space and the words are positive space that jumps out. The same is true in photography. Look at the scene behind me, for example. Obviously, you've got the mountain and the wildflowers and the trees that all pop out and attract attention. This makes them positive space. On the other hand, the little bit of sky that's in the image fades into the background. It's completely empty, so our eye is not attracted to it. This makes it negative space. Positive and negative space are so important in landscape photography because of the emotional impacts that they convey. Think about a scene, for example, that's almost entirely made out of snow, and the only little bit of subject detail that you can see is the outline of a mountain in the distance. Now obviously this photograph is almost entirely made out of negative space, and because of that it conveys a sense of isolation. On the other hand, think about a photograph in a forest environment, where there's tons of tree trunks and leaves all over the photograph. Obviously this image is going to be filled with positive space, which makes it appear significantly more chaotic. Ultimately, not every scene that you photograph will have high amounts of positive space or high amounts of negative space. However, by moving around and changing your composition, you can add or subtract positive and negative space to almost any photo. Ultimately, by doing so, you can change the entire way that an image looks and feels. When you're photographing a scene, one of the first compositional decisions that you have to make is which elements to include within the frame. If you cut off any of your subjects with the frame, intentionally or unintentionally, it could lead to a feeling of incompleteness. Take the scene behind me, for example. If I lower the camera and cut off the top of Mount Rainier, obviously that would be very distracting. However, the same is true if I have a secondary or tertiary subject, such as an interesting rock at the bottom of the frame. If I compose my image so that it cuts off the rock, that would lead to a feeling of incompleteness, and the scene could be very distracting. So when you're out taking photos, you've always got to pay attention to the edges of your frame and make sure that you're not cutting off any of your important subjects. While you're making sure that you don't cut off any of your subjects with the edge of the frame, it's also important to give the elements in your image some breathing space. For example, if I'm taking a picture of Mount Rainier, even if I include all of it in the photograph, I don't want to have such little sky between the mountain and the top of the frame that it looks like it's touching the edge of the image. As humans, we really like having additional space, and we don't like feeling constrained. And the same is true in photography. If all of your items press up against the edges of the frame, even if they're not completely cut off, it can look very distracting. Another problem you may encounter is when your subjects cross one another, in particular when a less important subject crosses over one that is more important. For example, in the scene behind me, there's a hill at the bottom of the frame that cuts into the trees along the ridgeline. Now obviously that's not good because then I can't see every part of the tree, even though the trees are separated from one another. Similarly, if I had a massive tree right behind me that went above Mount Rainier in the photograph and cut through its ridgeline, I would end up with a very distracting photograph. In this particular instance, I would probably move to a different location or a higher vantage point so that I could get rid of that detail. Ultimately, when you're taking pictures, pay attention to the details. Make sure that none of your important subjects are cut into by items that are less significant. Let's now move on to simplicity and exclusion. Now, when I'm composing my photographs, aside from balance, these are the two things that I pay the most attention to. So what are simplicity and exclusion? Well, first off, the goal is that every single item within your photograph contributes to the message that you're trying to convey. And the way that you do this is through excluding the items that take away from your message. For example, when I'm in a forest and there's a lot of chaotic elements all around me, I might want to tell the simple story of a tree and then a beam of light. In order to do that, I will focus in and move around so that my composition only shows those two elements. Every other detail I completely exclude just because it doesn't add anything to the frame. Another situation that you might find yourself in is photographing a mountain and then its reflection in a still pool of water. Now in this case, the mountain would be your primary subject and the reflection would be your secondary subject, and that would be the story of your photograph. If you have any rocks or logs at the bottom of your frame that cut into the secondary subject, obviously that would be very distracting. On one hand, you never want to cut one subject into another, which would certainly be the case in this example. On the other hand, a log or rocks just don't add anything to the message that you're trying to convey, so they can be safely excluded. So when I'm in the field taking pictures, I always want to convey the simplest, most direct message possible. And to do that, I always try to exclude any details that don't add to my message. It's not always possible, depending upon the scene, but when you can, any details that you exclude just make your photographs that much more powerful. At this point, I'd like to demonstrate all the things that we've been talking about at this location and show how they work in practice. Now, obviously, the scene behind me is really beautiful. We've got Mount Rainier, amazing wildflowers in the foreground, and we're hoping that the light will start to get good once sunset arrives. So let's turn it on over to the camera and I'll show you my thought process and how I would actually compose an image. First, let's talk about visual weight. Now, as you can see, the most important part of this photograph is the peak of the mountain in the middle of the frame. At the same time, there are other areas of interest as well. the wildflowers on the bottom are very saturated and bright, so obviously they have a lot of visual weight. There's also the glaciers on the right-hand side of the mountain, which are a little bit separate from the main peak, but they also carry a lot of visual weight because they're very bright and high in contrast. I have a few other subjects like trees and rocks, and these are important, but not to the degree as all the other things that I just mentioned. Now at this point, let's use all of these visual weights to compose a balanced photograph. So on one hand, you can see that if I move the frame too far over to the right, then the mountain is really, really heavy on the left and nothing really balances out on the right. If I do the reverse and I move the photograph all the way over to the left, the problem is even worse. At this point, it's just empty sky and empty grass that can't balance out the heavy weight of the mountain. At this point, I'm going to put the peak in the center of the photo so that the frame is more balanced. Now, if I wanted to, I could move my composition slightly to the right or slightly to the left and get my peak a little bit off center. Nothing nearly as extreme as the examples that I just showed, but just a bit to add some tension to the photo. In this particular case though, I'm more interested in getting the most balanced composition possible so that the photograph seems stable and peaceful. So what about positive and negative space? Well, in this image, there is a lot of positive space. It's all the things that I listed earlier, the mountain peak, the trees, the rocks at the bottom, the wildflowers, but there is also some negative space as well, and that's mostly the sky at the top of the image. So in this case, the composition is a little bit strict, but let's see what happens if I try to add some more negative space to this photo. So as you can see, when I'm adding more negative space to the image, I end up with a lot more sky and a lot less foreground. And that could be nice, but in this case, I actually really like my foreground, and that positive space is not too distracting in the photo. So here, I really don't want the additional negative space of the sky. Now, although those adjustments did add some negative space, this still isn't a negative space composition. There are a lot of areas of interest. So before I return the composition to normal, let's just see what happens when I create extreme levels of negative space within the same photo. So as I move it up and farther up, that's a lot of sky. Obviously, this photo does not look very good in this particular scene, but it does show a good example of why negative space can change the look and feel of your composition. So now let's just return it back to normal. So now I've got my composition back where I wanted it. What would happen if I brought it too far the other direction? So as you can see, if I lower the composition a little bit more, not to the point that I'm actually cutting off the mountain, but just to the point that it's right at the edge of the frame, that reduces the amount of breathing space that it has. And obviously, in this particular case, it just doesn't look very good. The same would be true if I extended it even farther down and I completely cut off the mountain. That's even worse, because as it is, I don't even see the main subject of my photograph. It's completely excluded from the frame, and that's not what I want. So let's return it back to normal. Now obviously it was a bad idea to cut off the top of the mountain, but that's not the only part of this image that I need to make sure to include within the frame. As I look around the edges of my composition, I can see on the right-hand side, there's the little bit of mountain which meets the hill of trees on the right. Now I could exclude this by moving the composition slightly farther to the left. And that's not nearly as big of a deal as it was when I cut off the top of the mountain, but it can be a little bit distracting. In this case, I want my image to include that little bit of mountain on the right so that you can see the entire transition of Mount Rainier onto the hill to the right. So as I look around the frame, I can tell that most of my subjects are fairly well isolated from one another. Even though the trees and then a little bit of the hill in the center of the photograph are overlapping with Mount Rainier, they're not intersecting with the glaciers or the main interesting part of the peak. So it's actually okay. I'd also like to draw attention to the 4 trees in the center of the photograph. If I were in a different position, slightly to the left or right with my tripod, then those trees might begin to overlap each other. But as it is, they don't overlap, which means that each one of them is isolated and you can see them in all of their detail. And that's exactly what I want. In terms of subject crossing, this frame is mostly good. There aren't any super important subjects being crossed over by really unimportant details. The only issue that I can see is that the hill at the bottom of the frame cuts off just a little bit of some of the trees along the center of the image. And this isn't a huge deal because I can still see a lot of the details in the trees, but ideally it wouldn't be the case. Still, as it is, it definitely does not ruin this photo, and I'm still very happy with how the scene is composed. Lastly are simplicity and exclusion. Now for this particular photo, I'm standing on an overlook, and I actually didn't have to worry that much about excluding nearby foreground details that detract from my message. Instead, everything that I want to say, which is really just the mountain and then the interesting wildflowers in the foreground, is already included within this frame. However, based on the focal length that I used, I am excluding some of the useless sky and grass details from the left-hand side of the frame, just because they don't really add to this message. Ultimately though, simplicity and exclusion, as important as they are, were not as crucial for this photograph as things like balance and other elements of composition. At this point, I'm happy with my composition. It's a beautiful scene. Hopefully the light will get good and we'll see some clouds later in the day so that I can use this composition in a photo.